Have you ever heard of Sodom and Gomorrah? Two cities mentioned in the Bible that carry one of the most impactful and, even today, controversial stories. But what really happened there? Was it divine justice, a natural tragedy, or something deeper that we still don't fully understand?
Hey, hold on. Before we get started, let's make a deal. If you're watching us right now, take a moment to subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and tell us in the comments. Where are you watching from? Oh, and if you'd like, share a message of faith or even ask a question. Who knows, it might become the topic of our next video, right?
Great idea. Now that you're part of our community, let's dive into this fascinating story that blends faith, mystery, and even archaeology. Get ready, because in today's episode, we'll take a deep dive into the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. The story of Sodom and Gomorrah is recorded in the book of Genesis, chapters 18 and 19. According to the biblical account, these cities were prosperous but also known for their corruption and immorality. That's when God decided to destroy them, sending two angels to the city to investigate and, if necessary, execute judgment.
Wait a second. Angels? Did they show up disguised, like regular people, or did they appear in a celestial glowing form?
Good question. According to the text, they took on the appearance of ordinary men. They arrived at Lot's house, Abraham's nephew, and he welcomed them as guests, showing hospitality. But that's when things started to escalate.
Escalate how? Give me an example, because now I'm picturing this like a movie scene.
Picture this. The men of the city of all ages surrounded Lot's house. They demanded that he hand over the visitors so they could abuse them. This act represented the peak of Sodom's moral corruption. Lot tried to protect the visitors, but the situation was spiraling out of control.
That sounds so disturbing, but at the same time, it feels like a metaphor for something bigger. Like, was it just about morality, or was it also a critique of the culture of the time?
Exactly. Many scholars argue that Sodom's sin wasn't just sexual immorality, but also a lack of hospitality, selfishness, and widespread violence. In the book of Ezekiel, chapter 16, verses 49 and 50, it's written that the main sin was pride, abundance of food, and neglect of the poor and needy.
So it was more complex than it seems at first glance. But going back to the story, what happened after Lot tried to protect the visitors?
The angels intervened. They blinded the men outside the house, preventing them from breaking in. Then they warned Lot that the destruction of the cities was inevitable. He was instructed to gather his family and flee immediately.
Wow, just imagine the panic. You're in the middle of a city about to be destroyed, and you have to grab whatever you can and run. But wait, how exactly did the destruction happen? Was it supernatural, or could there be a scientific explanation?
That's the thing. The Bible describes that God rained sulfur and fire from the heavens, completely destroying Sodom and Gomorrah. But over the years, scientists and archaeologists have tried to find natural explanations for the event, like volcanic eruptions, earthquakes, or even a meteorite impact.
Interesting. Does that mean there's physical evidence of these cities?
Yes. Excavations in the region near the Dead Sea have uncovered remnants of cities that could be Sodom and Gomorrah. For example, layers of ash and vitrified stones indicate destruction by extreme heat. This matches the biblical description, but could also be a natural phenomenon.
So, what we have here is a story that's not just about judgment and destruction, but also about choices and consequences, right? It's like Sodom and Gomorrah serve as a reminder of how a society's actions can shape its future.
Exactly. At the same time, the story also speaks about mercy, because Abraham, Lot's uncle, interceded for those cities, asking God to spare them if at least 10 righteous people could be found. Unfortunately, there weren't that many. It's a narrative full of meaning and lessons.
Well, before we dive into the more intense details of this story, don't forget to leave your name and a message in the comments. It's always great to see how you connect with these topics. Let's continue exploring what really happened in Sodom and Gomorrah together.
When the angels warned Lot about the impending destruction, he had to make a difficult and immediate decision: leave his home, his possessions, and even his stable life in Sodom. But there was a problem. Convincing his family to believe in the urgency of the warning.
That must have been a nightmare. Imagine trying to explain to people that everything is about to end and they need to leave everything behind right now. It's like one of those disaster movies where no one believes the protagonist.
Exactly. In fact, the Bible tells us that even Lot's sons-in-law, who were engaged to his daughters, mocked him, thinking he was joking. This detail highlights the disbelief and moral disconnect of society at that time.
And it also brings up an interesting point: how people often ignore warnings because they're too attached to comfort or routine. Do you think that's why Sodom and Gomorrah became symbols of decadence and judgment?
Absolutely. The narrative has deep layers that go beyond physical destruction. It's a reflection on choices, morality, and even the resistance to change. And that's not exclusive to that era. How many times do people ignore warning signs in our modern lives? Back to the story, the angels gave a clear command. Lot and his family had to flee immediately, and above all, not look back. This instruction is crucial because it symbolizes letting go of the past and the need to move forward, even in the midst of chaos.
Not looking back. It sounds simple, but in practice, it's hard. And it makes me wonder, was the act of looking back more than just curiosity? Maybe it symbolized how people struggle to fully let go of what holds them back.
Interesting perspective, and that's exactly what happens with Lot's wife. While fleeing, she disobeyed the command and looked back. The text says she was turned into a pillar of salt at that moment.
A pillar of salt. That sounds symbolic. But why salt? Is there any special meaning behind that?
Some interpretations suggest that salt represents barrenness or uselessness, something that cannot thrive. It could also reference the region's environment near the Dead Sea, which is rich in salt. But theologically, many see it as a warning about the consequences of disobedience and clinging to what is destructive. While Lot and his daughters managed to escape, the destruction began. The biblical account describes how God rained fire and sulfur on Sodom and Gomorrah, consuming everything: houses, fields, and even the vegetation around them.
That sounds so catastrophic. But is there a scientific explanation for this? Because let's be honest, fire and sulfur falling from the sky feels like something straight out of an apocalyptic movie.
There are actually a few scientific theories. One of the most popular suggests that a meteorite explosion in the atmosphere, similar to the Tunguska event in Siberia in 1908, could have occurred. This would explain the extreme heat that vitrified the soil and rocks found in excavations in the area.
Oh, I see. And does this theory have archaeological backing?
Yes, excavations at Tel El Hammam, a site near the Dead Sea, have uncovered evidence of violent destruction that matches the biblical description. Layers of ash, melted rocks, and abnormal sulfur levels suggest something extremely devastating. But of course, there's still debate over whether this truly proves the story of Sodom and Gomorrah.
But beyond the destruction, what else does this story aim to teach us? To me, it doesn't seem to be just about the punishment of two cities.
You're right. This story is not only about destruction, but also about mercy. Before destroying Sodom and Gomorrah, God allowed Abraham to intercede for them. Abraham asked God to spare the cities if at least 10 righteous people could be found in them.
10 people? That seems like so few, and yet there wasn't anyone righteous enough? That's heartbreaking.
It is, and it reinforces the idea that these cities were deeply corrupt. But at the same time, the story highlights that God was willing to spare everything for the sake of even a small number of good people. It's a powerful message about the impact of righteousness and goodness, even in a chaotic world. Sodom and Gomorrah have also become cultural and religious symbols over the centuries. In many texts and traditions, they represent the height of moral decay and the cost of disobedience to God.
And of course, this has led to many interpretations over time. Some people use this story to justify judgments, while others see it as a call for personal reflection. What's your take on it?
I'd say that more than a warning about punishment, this story is an opportunity to examine our own lives and choices. It reminds us that actions have consequences and that justice and mercy go hand in hand. In the end, Sodom and Gomorrah serve as a mirror for any society that neglects fundamental values.
That's true. And it also shows that there's always a way to start over, as we saw with Lot and his daughters. Even amidst destruction, life goes on, and new choices can be made.
After the dramatic escape from Sodom, Lot and his daughters found refuge in a small town called Zoar, as permitted by the angels. but fear still followed them. They were running from more than destruction. They were fleeing a world that had crumbled around them.
That makes sense. After witnessing something so traumatic, it's hard to just move on as if nothing happened. But tell me, why Zoar? Wasn't that city doomed as well?
Good question. Initially, Zoar was supposed to be destroyed along with the other cities, but Lot pleaded for him and his family to take refuge there. He argued they wouldn't survive fleeing to the mountains. And, out of mercy, the angels spared Zoar. This shows us that even in the midst of judgment, there was room for grace and understanding.
But they didn't stay there long, did they? I remember reading that Lot ended up leaving Zoar and moving to the mountains anyway.
Exactly. Although Zoar was spared, Lot feared for his and his daughter's safety. The trauma of Sodom's destruction still weighed heavily on them, and the idea of living in another city seemed risky. So, he decided to live in a cave in the mountains.
That's heartbreaking to imagine. A life once filled with comfort reduced to a refuge in a cave. It's like a symbol of how pride and decadence can lead to collapse.
Life in the mountains wasn't easy. Lot and his daughters faced solitude, insecurity, and a lack of prospects. And here the story takes an even more intriguing and, for many, controversial turn.
Controversial? Here we go. What happened that made people so uncomfortable?
Lot's daughters, concerned about the lack of descendants, came up with a plan to intoxicate their father and conceive children with him. They believed that, being the only known survivors, they needed to ensure the family's continuity.
Wow, that's heavy. But doesn't that reflect their desperation? I mean, think about it. They had lost everything: home, city, friends, and even their mother. They were isolated and had no one to guide them.
Without a doubt. It's important to remember that the context of the time was very different from ours. Continuing the family lineage was seen as essential, not just for survival, but also for identity and honor. But even so, this episode raises many moral and cultural questions. The daughter's plan worked and both conceived sons. The elder daughter had a son named Moab, and the younger had one named Ben-Ami. These two names became significant in biblical history as they gave rise to the Moabite and Ammonite peoples.
Wait, Moabites and Ammonites. Weren't those the people who later clashed with the Israelites?
Exactly. Throughout biblical history, these groups had a complex relationship with Israel, sometimes allies but often enemies. It's fascinating to think that these two nations arose from such a dramatic and improbable situation.
True. It shows how history is full of twists. What begins as a tragedy can somehow shape the future in unexpected ways. But do you think their controversial origin influenced how the Moabites and Ammonites were perceived by others?
Undoubtedly. Their origin is explicitly mentioned in the Bible, which may have contributed to the negative perception many had of these peoples. But it's also a reminder of how God can use even the most challenging circumstances to fulfill His purposes. Returning to the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, it's fascinating to see how this story continues to resonate today. It's mentioned in various parts of the Bible, including in the Gospels, where Jesus uses it as an example of judgment and repentance.
And not just in the Bible. The idea of Sodom and Gomorrah as symbols of decadence and destruction appears in various cultures and traditions. It's as if these cities have become universal archetypes of what happens when boundaries are crossed.
Exactly. And at the same time, the story also speaks of hope. Despite the destruction, Lot's lineage continued and new nations arose. This reminds us that even amid chaos, there are possibilities for new beginnings.
Interesting. It's as if Sodom and Gomorrah are both a warning and an invitation to reflect. How are we building our lives and societies? Are we promoting justice and kindness, or are we repeating the mistakes of the past?
To wrap up this part, we can't forget how archaeology has helped shed light on this story. Excavations around the Dead Sea region have revealed evidence consistent with the biblical account, such as cities destroyed by extreme heat and abnormally high levels of sulfur in the soil.
That's fascinating. Have these discoveries changed how people view this story? I mean, does it reinforce the biblical narrative or open up more room for debate?
Both. For many, these discoveries confirm the biblical account. For others, they're an opportunity to explore scientific explanations for events described as miraculous. Either way, it's a reminder that the story of Sodom and Gomorrah is about both faith and investigation.
And about modern lessons? What can we learn from this story today?
We can learn about the importance of justice, compassion, and living according to values that promote everyone's well-being. It's also a reminder that our choices have consequences, both individually and collectively.
I agree. And I think we can also use this story to reflect on how we treat one another and the world around us. In the end, Sodom and Gomorrah aren't just places of the past, they can be mirrors for the present.
When we think of Sodom and Gomorrah, we often limit ourselves to the biblical account. But the truth is, these cities have become cultural icons over the centuries, appearing in literature, art, and even philosophy.
That's interesting. So, beyond their mention in the Bible, these cities have inspired works in other contexts, like stories that aren't necessarily religious?
Exactly. For example, in classical literature, many authors used Sodom and Gomorrah as metaphors for moral decay or impending destruction. Works like Dante Alighieri's The Divine Comedy make direct references to them. In modern culture, the theme appears in movies, music, and even discussions about ethics and morality.
It's fascinating how these ancient stories still manage to impact the modern world. But why do you think Sodom and Gomorrah remain so relevant?
Probably because they deal with universal themes: justice, morality, and the consequences of human choices. Plus, the mystery surrounding their destruction sparks curiosity, even among those who don't have a religious connection to the narrative. Now, shifting focus a bit, it's important to talk about the theological implications of this story. For many religious traditions, Sodom and Gomorrah represent God's judgment on humanity, but also His mercy.
I get the judgment part, but where does the mercy come in? After all, the cities were destroyed.
Good observation. Mercy is seen in the fact that God spared Lot and his family. And we can't forget Abraham's intercession, where he asked God to spare the cities if righteous people were found there. It shows that God was willing to reconsider His judgment based on individual justice.
Interesting. So, the story isn't just about punishment, but also about hope and the possibility of redemption.
Exactly. And that's what makes this narrative so profound. It balances justice and mercy in a way that makes us reflect on how we approach these issues in our own lives. So far, we've touched on some archaeological evidence related to Sodom and Gomorrah, but let's dive deeper. Recent excavations at the site of Tall El Hammam have brought new data to light.
Tall El Hammam, what's that? Is it the modern name for one of the cities?
Not exactly. Tall El Hammam is an archaeological site in the Jordan Valley near the Dead Sea. Many archaeologists believe it could be the location of Sodom because of the evidence found there.
And what did they find there that's so significant?
They discovered layers of ash and vitrified soil, suggesting destruction caused by extreme heat. Additionally, elevated levels of sulfur were identified in the area, aligning with the biblical description of fire and sulfur raining down from the sky.
That's fascinating. But is this definitive proof that we're talking about Sodom and Gomorrah?
There's no consensus yet. Some experts argue that the evidence is compelling, while others suggest these phenomena could have natural causes, like a meteor explosion or seismic activity. Either way, these discoveries have reignited interest in the story. Beyond the archaeological and theological debates, the story of Sodom and Gomorrah also offers practical lessons. It reminds us of the importance of values like justice, hospitality, and compassion.
I agree. It also makes us think about how our actions can impact not just our own lives, but entire communities. It's like a domino effect, don't you think?
Absolutely. And this applies to both good and bad actions. Sodom and Gomorrah are extreme examples of what happens when moral and ethical values are ignored, but they also show that even amidst chaos, there's always a chance to choose a different path.
And that's something we can all apply in our daily lives. Small choices can make a big difference, not just for ourselves, but for those around us.
To wrap up this part, I'd like to leave you with a reflection. The story of Sodom and Gomorrah isn't just about the past. It's a powerful reminder of the present and the future.
True. It challenges us to look at our own lives and the society we live in. Are we cultivating values that promote justice and collective well-being? Or are we repeating the mistakes of the past?
That's a question each of us must answer for ourselves. And perhaps the greatest lesson from this story is that it's never too late to change. There's always the possibility of starting over, as long as we're willing to make better choices.
Well said, and it shows that even in stories of judgment and destruction, there's hope and redemption for those who choose the right path.
We're reaching the end of this journey through the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. But before we move forward, we'd like to invite you to subscribe to the channel and leave your like. This helps bring stories like this to more people. Oh, and don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments.
That's right. Your engagement means so much to us. And of course, let us know. Which lesson from this story do you feel connects most with today's world? Let's keep this conversation going there.
Now back to the story. It's amazing how Sodom and Gomorrah remain relevant, not just as religious symbols, but also as metaphors for social and cultural issues. These cities teach us about choices, responsibility, and above all, the importance of reflecting on the impact of our actions. Sodom and Gomorrah challenge us to think beyond matters of judgment and punishment. They are a call for introspection. What are we doing to build a more just and compassionate society?
And this is a question that goes far beyond religion. It's about humanity, about how we treat one another and how we interact with the world around us. Perhaps more than a divine warning, this story is an invitation to change.
Exactly. And this is where the transformative power of biblical narratives comes in. They show us that even in the midst of great failures, there is always an opportunity to learn, grow, and make better choices.
That really makes you think, doesn't it? Maybe the true miracle of these stories is their ability to transcend centuries and still teach us, even in a world so different from the one in which they were written.
As we look to the past, we are also called to look to the future. Sodom and Gomorrah may have been destroyed, but the lessons they left behind remain alive. They invite us to think about how we want to shape our world.
And this is more relevant than ever. In a time when we face so many global challenges, climate change, inequality, conflicts, perhaps the greatest mistake would be to ignore the warnings history offers us.
Absolutely. And at the same time, we need to remember that change starts with us. Small actions, acts of kindness, and ethical choices can have a profound impact, even if they aren't immediately visible.
So in the end, Sodom and Gomorrah aren't just a story about destruction, but also about rebuilding, about how we can transform the world, one step at a time.
Before we wrap up, it's worth noting that regardless of your beliefs, the story of Sodom and Gomorrah invites us to reflect on our faith and our humanity. It reminds us that justice isn't just about punishment, but also about compassion and mercy.
And it also reminds us that no one is perfect. We all have flaws, but we also have the ability to change, to repent, and to seek a better path.
Exactly. And that's what makes this story so powerful. It challenges us to be better, not out of fear of judgment, but because we know we can make a difference.
So why not start today? Small gestures can transform lives, both ours and those of the people around us.
And so we conclude our journey through Sodom and Gomorrah. We hope this story has touched you in some way, and that today's reflections inspire positive actions in your daily life.
And before you go, remember to subscribe to the channel, leave your like, and share this video with someone you think might find this story interesting. Your participation helps keep this work alive and bring important messages to more people.
That's right. And don't forget, the story of Sodom and Gomorrah is more than a tale from the past. It's a message for the present and a vision for the future. Thank you for joining us on this journey.
See you next time, everyone, and may we continue learning, growing, and building a better world together.